Welcome to the Business of Government Hour TV, a video companion to our flagship radio program. I'm Michael Keegan, your host. Each week, government executives and thought leaders join me for an informative, insightful, and in-depth conversation on improving government effectiveness. These individuals are truly changing the way government does business. What is the U.S. Customs and Border Protection's national strategy to facilitate legitimate trade? How is it strengthening comprehensive trade enforcement? And what is the biggest disruption coming to the trade community? I'll explore these questions and so much more with Brenda Smith, Executive Assistant Commissioner, Office of Trade, within the U.S. Customs and Border Protection. My co-host from IBM is Don Fenhagen. Take a look and take a listen, and don't forget to download the entire interview at iTunes or at businessofgovernment.org. The Office of Trade. How is it organized? Can you tell us a little bit about its mission, how it's organized, the size of your budget relative to the agency's budget, if you can get into that kind of a number, and how many folks you have working with you?
Sure. So the Office of Trade is really charged by the Commissioner to carry out CBP's trade mission, which really goes to the compliance of goods coming into and going out of the United States, as well as the collection of $46 billion a year in duties, taxes, and fees. My office, the Office of Trade, really has a number of functions to be able to do that. We have a policy and program function, which really go to the core programs like the protection of intellectual property rights and the collection of anti-dumping and countervailing duties. We also have a large, nearly 400 regulatory auditors that work with the importing community to assess compliance. We have a group that focuses on trade enforcement solely. We have a trade transformation office that is, as it says, looking to transform what we do every day to make it sure it supports the American economy. And then the final group is regulations and rulings that issues essentially guidance to the trade community on what the laws and regulations really mean.
Trade's one of the most interesting topics in government right now. What are the most serious threats and critical trends that are shaping and informing your strategy?
So, I couldn't agree more that trade is a high-profile issue right now, which is great for us. Because it gives us the opportunity to have the conversation about what trade should be. In terms of the challenges that we're working to manage, I think one is actually the information integration. So we collect, as the government, a great deal of information about the trade crossing the border. But there's also a lot of open source information and trying to understand how we use that to predict where problem areas are. So that's sort of one trend as technology gets better and there's just an explosion of information, trying to understand how to use that. I think the other explosion we're dealing with is in the volume of trade. And we've seen steady increase as we become more globally interconnected, that people think nothing of going online and ordering something from all the way around the world and expecting it to show up on their doorstep in 24 hours. That happens all the time. I think with that increase in volume, we've also seen a change in the trading pattern. People call it e-commerce, but it really is the facilitation by the internet of a lot more players in trade patterns, a significant increase in speed, and a significant increase in the number of transactions we see. So if you recall, back in the late 50s, trade went from burlapped, wrapped bundles on a big ship into containers. And now when you drive the New Jersey Turnpike through Newark, you see stacks of containers. Well, now what we're seeing more is mountains of small packages as they're being shipped from around the world. So our ability to look at a shipment is much more dispersed, or it's challenged by being much more dispersed. It's also challenged because we've got a lot more unique players, people who have never done this before and are now importing goods or exporting goods. So we're trying to wrap our heads around and our operational processes around how to manage those flows.
February 2016, that probably rings a bell to you. That's the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act. It was signed into law. There were many requirements in that law. A year after, how has the law helped CBP to strengthen trade enforcement? What's that done for your area of expertise, and what does the future hold in that area?
So that passage, the passage of that piece of legislation was really seminal for CBP. It was our first authorization since the agency was established, so 15, 16 years. And there, I think, was a lot of pent-up demand, legislative demand. So it's a very big law covering a lot of ground. I think we counted and we had 30 reports, studies, strategies, or plans required by the law. But almost really more important were two things. One was the guidance that we got from our congressional stakeholders that enforcement of trade laws was really critical to the economy, and facilitation as important. So that was one piece. The other thing that we got from that law were some new tools and some new ways of thinking about some of our enforcement challenges. So I would point specifically to the Enforce and Protect Act, which was required us to take a new look at the way we addressed allegations of not just noncompliance, but evasion of our trade laws. And then when information was brought to CBP about possible evasion, we were then put on timelines to execute our analysis and then take enforcement action to deter or stop future evasion. And then, and this is a little unusual in the law enforcement environment, we had to report back to the person that brought the allegation about what we did. And that's a little unusual. Yeah. So we were a little resistant at first, but I think we've really wrapped our head around it with the help of the private sector, who said, look, this is a good thing. This is a really good thing. And there's tools here that you can use that will help you do a better job of enforcing the law. So it's been a big change for us. There's still a lot in that law that we are teasing out. I think we recognize that we've got to invest to make some of the aspirational parts of the law a reality, invest in people, invest in automation, but we are getting there.
Brenda, you've pointed out the mission of CBP and recognizing how critical our trade enforcement and facilitation role is in protecting the nation's economic security. What I'd like to talk about now is your office's, the Office of Trade, its strategic priorities. And could you give us a sense of CBP's national strategy to facilitate legitimate trade?
We have sort of an inherent tension in what we do every day between facilitation and enforcement. And what we've learned over the last couple of years is that we don't balance between these two. They actually complement each other. If we get one right, then the other is easier to do. And, we often use the metaphor of the needle in a haystack, but what we're really trying to do is make that haystack smaller. We do that through data. We do that through using our skills around industry expertise, analytical skills, the ability to use data appropriately. And so as we look at the strategic priorities of the Office of Trade and trying to enforce and facilitate, I'm looking at the ability to integrate the data that we have and use it to make good risk-based decisions. So that's a really critical thing, and that means investment in automation, as well as being able to have the right skills to analyze the data and then act on it. I think another critical piece of it is the relationship we have with the private sector. A lot of the information and a lot of the education we get about the industry issues, compliance, enforcement, actually comes straight from the trade community. And so our ability to work with them to gather that information and act on it is really important, as is the ability to collaborate with the private sector to come up with solutions, whether it's a compliance issue or we want to streamline a traditional process that they're telling us just no longer works for them. So I think our efforts around information integration, around increasing the skills, and then collaborating with the private sector would really be sort of the three priorities, enablers that we use to make enforcement and facilitation happen.
So, you mentioned earlier that CBP continues to focus on simplifying and speeding up cross-border commerce while reducing the cost of importing and exporting goods. And one way you're doing that, and I'd like to explore the implementation of the International Trade Data System, or the single window, as they say, system. What could you tell us about that effort? What are the benefits derived from it? And how does automating the collection and dissemination of information enhance data quality?
There's a couple of drivers that have led us in the United States to making the commitment, actually, the President making the commitment to what is known as the single window. There's an international standard that calls on governments to establish one place for all information required by a government about goods crossing borders to come into, and then the government to respond to that information from that one place. And so it is literally a single window in some countries where paper forms about exports get submitted into the teller behind the window, and in other places it is in fact an electronic portal like we've just built here in the United States. What we did in building of that single window was to take the information requirements of 47 different government agencies and package them in one package. And in many cases, it allowed us to transition from a paper-based form collection of that information into an electronic receptacle. And so what we call a message set, one package of information could be submitted to the government. The government would look at that information, having dispersed it to all the agencies that were interested, and then come back with one response about whether we needed to stop that shipment and take a closer look at it, whether it was free to go on down the road, or whether we needed to collect more information. And so if you're sitting in the private sector, instead of dealing with, let's say, 5 or 6 different government agency systems or paper forms to collect information, you're dealing with one. And when you get the green flag that says your cargo is safe and compliant and good to move down the road, then that's good. That gives you predictability, and you don't have to call 5 different places looking for an answer. And so what you may have picked up on is this is not just about automation. It's about the operational processes that go along with the automation, so that as a government, we're presenting one face at the border, and our private sector partners can get information and get decisions from one place rather than multiple places.
But it wasn't easy, was it? And I know you led it. And so what I would like to talk about is the actual implementation, some of the significant challenges you faced or that was faced in developing the single window system, and how you addressed them. But even more importantly, perhaps you could tell us more about how you approached this effort and what lessons you've learned.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So it, for me, was a real fundamental opportunity to bring together a lot of the skills I've developed over my government career. But really, it was about understanding how important automation generally, but particularly this system that integrated requirements from around the government into one place could make a difference in our economy. Some of the challenges really stemmed from the many different missions that we try to execute as a government, whether it's food safety, drug safety, the safety of children's toys, the security of containers coming into the United States, and how do we integrate and address all of those missions? Because we have government employees that are passionate about executing those missions. So how do we work together to allow all of us to execute our missions? And so it took a lot of conversation. It took a lot of trying to identify the best practices that we could use as a government. For example, do we really need a paper form with a blue ink signature collected on every transaction? And as a government, we had to make the decision that, if we get a digital signature, that's probably okay, as long as we have traceability through our system. So overcoming those hurdles the way we've always done business, and coming together to prioritize building a collaborative system, and then working with the private sector to roll it out in a way that they could ingest and build their own systems to connect, and then that together we could train all of our employees. And our guess is there are probably close to 1 million people that had to be trained on this system because there are so many people that use it. And it was a new way of doing business. And they all had to be trained, and they all had to understand the requirements. And so a lot of it was simple change management, but on a really large scale.
I often talk, and you've mentioned this a couple of times, but I often ask my guests about how they leverage partnerships and collaboration to improve operations and mission outcomes. Mm-hmm. And I know you do it with the private sector. I know you do with the 47 agencies that you referenced earlier. I'd like for you to elaborate on that, if you will, but more importantly, how do you do it with international partners? Do you folks get together with different equivalent offices in the EU or in different countries around the world?
So we do, and I actually want to touch on, before I get to the international side, touch on a couple of groups that have been really important for us. We have a very active federal advisory committee. We call it the COAC. It's the Commercial Operations Advisory Committee. And for me, it's like having 20 free consultants, very highly educated consultants. The COAC is an advisory group, advisory to the Commissioner of Customs about trade issues, what's going well, what's not going well, and how to fix it. And our COAC, which is then it's also supported by a number of working groups in which we pull in other representatives of the private sector to work through a strategic agenda of where the gaps are in our mission, where our operations could be improved, and from a policy perspective, how do we want to advocate for a stronger economy? Extraordinarily helpful. We have a similar group at the tactical level, specifically around automation, called the Trade Support Network. And I think that those two groups, they take a lot of time to manage, a lot of time to engage with, but really produce really good results. We've seen and taken many of the ideas coming out of the conversations with those groups into the international environment. Mm-hmm. The World Customs Organization is the umbrella organization for the close to 200 member countries, all with customs administrations, and customs being one of the traditional functions of government. The World Customs Organization has been around a long time and plays a very active role in doing that, looking around corners, and how do we strategically prepare for the next challenge. We also have a number of efforts, and I would point specifically to Canada and Mexico. Our North American customs partnership is very strong, very active. We share information, we share best practices, we have conversations about everything ranging from employee resilience to trade targeting, to how our anti-dumping and countervailing systems work. So it's a really good partnership with Canada and Mexico. We, of course, have bilateral relationships as well. But what's very interesting to me is the connection that our private sector partners have made for us between some of the best practices we use here, like real collaboration with the private sector, to bring those best practices to partners around the world.
I hope you've enjoyed this edition of the Business of Government Hour TV, a video companion to our flagship radio program. Until next time, it's businessofgovernment.org.